Look at the screen in front of you. Touch the surface beneath your fingers. Listen to the sounds around you. Now, ask yourself the most unsettling question in the history of human thought. How do you know any of this is actually real? For centuries, Western philosophy was dominated by a seductive belief that truth resides deep within our rational souls, that we are born with innate ideas, or that pure logic alone can unlock the secrets of the universe. But in the early 17th century, a radical intellectual insurgency emerged. A group of fearless thinkers decided to burn the old textbooks, abandon metaphysical speculation, and turn their gaze outward, toward the messy, chaotic, and undeniable world of sensory experience. They called this new faith Empiricism. At its core, Empiricism is deceptively simple. Nihil est in intellectu quod non sit prius in sensu. Nothing is in the mind that wasn't first in the senses. Yet, the implications of this single proposition are seismic. If all knowledge is derived from perception, then what happens to God? To the soul? To the very concept of a stable self? Empiricism didn't just refine epistemology. It detonated a philosophical time bomb that gave birth to modern science, experimental psychology, and even artificial intelligence. But here's the paradox. If knowledge comes only from experience, how can we ever be certain of anything? Can we trust our eyes when they lie to us? Can we ever prove that the sun will rise tomorrow just because it has risen every day before? In this video, we are going to navigate the treacherous waters of classical empiricism through its 5 most monumental figures. We will begin with the man who taught us how to observe. We will encounter the rebel who denied the existence of matter itself. And we will end with the ultimate skeptic who took empiricism so seriously that he practically destroyed the concept of causality, forcing philosophy to start over from scratch. By the end of this intellectual odyssey, you will never mistake your own perceptions for objective reality again. You will understand why modern scientists obsess over data, why psychologists are skeptical of memory, and why, in a very real sense, we are all prisoners of our own senses. So, are you ready to question absolutely everything? Let's begin. Our first philosopher is not just the father of British empiricism. He is the man who invented the very blueprint of modern scientific inquiry. Number 1. Sir Francis Bacon. Imagine Europe in the late 16th century. Universities are dominated by a stale intellectual orthodoxy. Scholars spend their entire lives debating how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, or poring over the dusty pages of Aristotle, treating his word as infallible gospel. They rely on deduction, starting with a grand, abstract principle and trying to fit the messy world into it. Enter Sir Francis Bacon, a statesman, a lawyer, and a fiercely ambitious philosopher. Bacon looked at this intellectual stagnation and felt nothing but visceral contempt. He famously compared the scholastic philosophers to spiders, spinning intricate, beautiful webs of logic, but entirely out of their own internal substance, with no connection to the actual world. In his monumental work, The Advancement of Learning, he delivered a scathing verdict on these dogmatists. They are ill discoverers that think there is no land when they can see nothing but sea. For Bacon, the scholastics were terrified of the vast, uncharted ocean of empirical reality, so they clung desperately to the tiny, familiar islands of ancient authority. He declared that this must end. Bacon argued that true knowledge cannot come from armchair speculation. It must come from a humble, patient interrogation of nature itself. He christened his new method the inductive method. Here is the fundamental difference. Deduction moves from the general to the particular. Induction, in Bacon's vision, moves from the particular to the general. Instead of saying, all metals conduct electricity, so copper must, you must first conduct thousands of experiments, observe countless instances of heating and cooling, document the behaviors of various substances, and then, and only then, allow a general law to emerge slowly from the accumulated evidence. For Bacon, this wasn't just an abstract epistemological exercise, it was a utilitarian mission. He famously declared in his Novum Organum, "Truth, therefore, and utility are here the very same things." In other words, knowledge that doesn't improve the human condition, that doesn't yield practical results in the material world, is worthless sophistry. In his own immortal words, which have become the battle cry of modern science, nature, to be commanded, must be obeyed. You cannot force nature into your textbooks. You must listen to what nature actually shows you. But Bacon was not naive. He knew that our minds are not neutral instruments of observation. We are riddled with biases and cognitive distortions that contaminate our sensory data. To address this, he introduced his most psychologically profound concept, the four idols of the mind. And here, Bacon's prose reaches its philosophical peak. Describing the inherent fallibility of human cognition itself, he wrote, "The human understanding is like a false mirror, which, receiving rays irregularly, distorts and discolors the nature of things by mingling its own nature with it." Listen carefully to those idols, because they are still wildly relevant today. First, the idols of the tribe. These are the inherent fallacies of human nature itself. Because our senses are dull and our intellects are easily swayed by wishful thinking, we tend to see patterns where none exist. We find order in chaos because our brains crave it. Second, the idols of the cave. These are our personal, subjective biases shaped by our unique education, upbringing, and personal experiences. Each of us lives in our own cave of prejudice, which tints everything we perceive. Third, the idols of the marketplace. These are the deceptions caused by language and the misuse of words. We often argue over vague, poorly defined terms like justice or fate, mistaking the word for the thing itself. And finally, the idols of the theater. These are the false philosophical systems that we inherit uncritically, the grand, dramatic plays of dogma, tradition, and outdated authority that we absorb without questioning. Bacon's radical prescription was simple, yet terrifyingly ambitious. We must methodically purge these idols from our minds. We must start with a clean slate, collect observational data like diligent detectives gathering clues, and use experiments to cross-examine nature. Now here's the critical paradox of Francis Bacon that often gets overlooked. Despite being the ultimate high priest of observation, Bacon never actually performed any major scientific discoveries himself. He was the architect, not the builder. He gave us the blueprint, not the skyscraper. But that blueprint became the cornerstone of the Royal Society in England, and eventually the entire edifice of modern science. Without Bacon, there would be no peer review, no lab notebooks, no systematic experimentation. He didn't just create a method, he created a mindset. He taught humanity to ask, what does the evidence say, rather than what does the authority say? However, Bacon left a massive metaphysical question unanswered. He talked about observing matter, but he never explained what matter actually is, or how the observing mind relates to the physical world. That monumental task fell to his brilliant and profoundly more radical successor, a man who claimed that even thought itself is just mechanical motion, and who famously declared that life itself is nothing but a perpetual and restless desire for power. Let's move to our second philosopher, the materialist who turned the human mind into a machine, Thomas Hobbes. If Francis Bacon was the architect of the scientific method, our second philosopher is the engineer who ripped down the walls between the spiritual and the physical, reducing the entire human soul to a set of clattering gears and mechanical impulses. Meet Thomas Hobbes. Most people remember Hobbes as the grim political theorist who gave us Leviathan, that terrifying image of the state as a mortal god ruling over a chaotic, brutal human nature. But beneath his political philosophy lies a ruthlessly consistent empiricist metaphysics that is far more radical than anything Bacon ever dared to imagine. In the opening chapter of his magnum opus, Leviathan, Hobbes issues an uncompromising declaration that sets the tone for everything that follows. For there is no conception in a man's mind which hath not at first, totally or by parts, been begotten upon the organs of sense. Notice the word organs. Hobbes is not speaking in poetic metaphors. He is speaking in the language of biology and physics. For him, the human mind is not a mysterious, immaterial substance gifted by divine intervention. It is a physical apparatus, operating under the exact same mechanical laws that govern a falling stone or a turning wheel. For Hobbes, the universe is nothing but matter in motion. There is no spirit, no soul, no ghost in the machine. When an external object presses upon our sensory organs, our eyes, our ears, our skin, it triggers an internal motion within our nervous system, and that motion, Hobbes claims, is what we call perception. Now, here comes his most astonishing and psychologically profound claim. If perception is simply motion, then what happens when that motion fades? What is memory? What is imagination? Hobbes answers with breathtaking elegance and terrifying finality. The imagination is nothing but decaying sense. Let that sink in. Decaying sense. Not a creative flight of fancy, not a divine spark of ingenuity, not a window into a higher Platonic realm. Your most vivid memories, your wildest fantasies, your deepest nostalgias, they are merely the faint residual vibrations of previous physical impacts upon your nervous system, slowly fading away like the ripples on a pond after the stone has sunk. But Hobbes does not stop there. If imagination is decaying sense, then what happens to the boundary between waking reality and dreams? This is where Hobbes becomes deeply unsettling and eerily prescient of modern neuroscience. He writes, "For it is a hard matter to distinguish between sense and dreaming." Hobbes is not saying that we cannot tell whether we are awake or asleep in our daily lives. What he means is far more profound. Both waking perception and dreaming are constructed from the exact same sensory material. The only difference is that in waking life, the external object is actually present and pressing upon us. In dreams, the internal motions are strong enough to mimic that pressure independently. In other words, both states are physiological, both are mechanical. Neither provides a guaranteed access to an absolute transcendent truth. And here is where Hobbes's empiricism reaches its logical, almost cybernetic conclusion. He extends this mechanical worldview to the very process of reasoning itself. He famously defined reason not as a mystical intuition, but as a computational operation. Reason is nothing but reckoning, adding and subtracting of the consequences of general names. For Hobbes, sticking is calculation. When we reason, we are simply adding and subtracting the names of things in our minds, using language as a system of symbols. This is why he is often celebrated as the grandfather of modern artificial intelligence, because he was the first to suggest that the human mind operates like a sophisticated calculator. Now, let us pause and appreciate the sheer audacity of Hobbes's vision. He effectively abolished the immortal soul from philosophy. He reduced consciousness to physical motion. He stripped imagination of its romantic mystique, and he made reason a mere mechanical computation. But in doing so, Hobbes left his successors with a devastating metaphysical crisis. If everything is matter in motion, and if our perceptions are just internal motions caused by external pressures, then how can we ever be sure that our internal motions correspond to a real external world? What if the external world is not matter at all, but simply a collection of sensations in our minds? This crisis, the gap between the mechanical world and the perceived world, was the exact problem that the next philosopher decided to resolve, and he resolved it with one of the most famous metaphors in the entire history of Western thought, a metaphor that begins with the image of a completely blank, untouched piece of white paper. Let's move to our third philosopher, the man who framed the modern mind as a tabula rasa, John Locke. Thomas Hobbes left us with a mechanical universe where even thought is just motion, but he never fully explained how mere motion inside our heads manages to represent a world outside them. He left the relationship between the physical and the perceived perilously unclear. Enter John Locke, 1632 to 1704. If Bacon laid the foundation and Hobbes built the radical skeleton, Locke is the man who furnished the entire house of empiricism, turning it into a coherent, systematic, and breathtakingly influential philosophical edifice. He is rightly celebrated as the undisputed father of classical empiricism, and Locke begins his monumental essay concerning human understanding with one of the most famous, most iconic metaphors in the entire history of Western philosophy. He writes, "Let us then suppose the mind to be, as we say, white paper, void of all characters, without any ideas. How comes it to be furnished? Whence has it all the materials of reason and knowledge? To this I answer, in one word, from experience. The tabula rasa, the blank slate. This is not just a poetic image, it is a declaration of total epistemological war against the rationalists. Plato believed we were born with innate knowledge of forms. Descartes believed God had imprinted the idea of perfection upon our souls. Locke rejects all of this as intellectual laziness. He argues that there are no innate principles, no inborn moral maxims, and no pre-installed software in the human mind. We are born as empty vessels, and the entire content of our consciousness, every thought, every memory, every abstract concept, must be written onto that blank slate by the hand of sensory experience. But Locke does not stop at simply asserting that experience fills the mind. He performs a crucial philosophical dissection, dividing experience into two distinct streams. He names them sensation and reflection. Sensation is the external input, the data we receive from the outer world through our five senses. Reflection, however, is the internal input, the mind's observation of its own operations, its own acts of thinking, doubting, believing, and reasoning. For Locke, even our most abstract ideas, like the idea of infinity or time, are ultimately derived from reflection upon our inner mental states. In his own precise words, captured in the same opening chapter, these two are the fountains of knowledge, from whence all the ideas we have, or can naturally have, do spring. Now, here we arrive at Locke's most enduring and most philosophically explosive contribution, his famous distinction between primary and secondary qualities. This single conceptual move permanently altered the relationship between human perception and physical reality. Locke argues that certain qualities truly exist in the objects themselves, independent of any observer. He calls these primary qualities. These include solidity, extension, size, figure, shape, number, and motion. Even if every conscious being in the universe vanished, the table would still be solid, the stone would still be round, and the atoms would still be moving. They are inseparable from the physical substance. But then there are secondary qualities. These are colors, sounds, tastes, and smells. These, Locke famously declares, are not actually in the objects at all. They are merely powers that the primary qualities of the object have to produce certain sensations in our minds. As he explains with startling clarity, what is sweet, blue, or warm in idea is but the certain bulk, figure, and motion of the insensible parts in the bodies themselves. Let us sit with the implications of this for a moment. When you see a red apple, the redness is not inherently inside the apple. The apple is simply a collection of particles with a specific surface texture that reflects light in a particular wavelength. That reflected light hits your retina, triggers neural impulses, and your brain constructs the experience of redness. The color exists only in your mind, not in the object. The sweetness exists only in your taste buds, not in the fruit. This is the core of Locke's representative realism. We do not perceive the external world directly. We perceive its effects upon us. Our ideas are representations, mental copies, of a physical reality that remains forever partially hidden behind the veil of perception. Now, this is a brilliant and deeply intuitive framework, and it remains the bedrock of modern cognitive science. But Locke has bequeathed us a haunting, almost claustrophobic problem. If everything we experience is merely a representation in our minds, and if we can never step outside our own perceptions to compare those representations with the physical objects themselves, how can we ever be certain that the physical objects actually exist? What if the physical world is not the cause of our perceptions at all? What if our perceptions are all there is? What if matter itself is just an unnecessary hypothesis, a ghost we have invented to explain our own sensory data? One man looked at Locke's system and decided to take empiricism with such ruthless, uncompromising consistency that he simply denied the existence of the material world altogether. He declared that to be is to be perceived. Let's move to our fourth philosopher, the radical idealist who asked, if a tree falls in the forest and no one is there, does it make a sound? And answered with a definitive, breathtaking no, George Berkeley. John Locke gave us a comforting, sensible picture of the world. He told us that there is a physical reality out there, atoms, shapes, and motions, and our minds faithfully represented through sensory ideas. It feels safe, rational, and deeply intuitive. But our fourth philosopher looked at Locke's system and saw a fatal, almost cowardly inconsistency. He asked a devastatingly simple question. If all we ever perceive are our own ideas, and if we can never step outside our minds to compare those ideas with the physical objects they supposedly represent, then why on earth are we so certain that these physical objects exist at all? Meet George Berkeley, 1685 to 1753, an Irish Anglican bishop, a brilliant rhetorician, and arguably the most audacious metaphysician in the empiricist tradition. Berkeley took empiricism to its absolute, ruthless, logical conclusion. and performed an intellectual gesture that still shocks philosophy students to this day. He simply denied the existence of matter. In his masterpiece, a treatise concerning the principles of human knowledge, Berkeley opens with a scathing critique of Locke's primary/secondary quality distinction. He points out, with irrefutable logic, that Locke's own system is internally flawed. Locke claimed that primary qualities like shape and motion are objective and exist independently of perception. But Berkeley asks, can you actually imagine an object that has size and shape without any color? Can you conceive of motion without any accompanying sensory quality? The answer is no. As he famously writes, it is impossible to conceive extension or motion without color or other sensible qualities. You cannot strip away the sensory qualities and leave a bare, neutral substance behind. The very concept of an unperceived matter is, for Berkeley, a meaningless abstraction, a ghost we have invented to explain our own experiences, but which explains nothing at all. And then, Berkeley delivers the philosophical hammer blow that defines his entire legacy. He declares that the very existence of physical objects is entirely contingent upon being perceived. He crystallizes this doctrine into one of the most famous, most quoted, most debated principles in the entire Western canon. Esse est percipi. To be is to be perceived. Let me say that again. To be is to be perceived. For Berkeley, the existence of a tree, a stone, or a book consists solely in its being perceived by a mind. If no mind is perceiving it, it simply does not exist. Not in the sense that it continues to exist but we don't know it. No. For Berkeley, existence without perception is a logical contradiction, like a square circle. In his own unmistakable prose, he writes, "The table I write on, I say, exists. That is, I see and feel it. And if I were out of my study, I should say it existed, meaning thereby that if I was in my study, I might perceive it." Notice what Berkeley is doing here. He is not denying that the table exists when you are looking at it. He is denying that the table has any existence apart from being perceived. The table's entire reality is its perceivability. When you leave the room, the table does not vanish into nothingness. Not quite, because Berkeley is a bishop, and he has the ultimate trump card, God. Since God is an infinite, eternal, omnipresent mind, he constantly perceives everything. Therefore, the universe continues to exist in the divine mind, even when finite human minds are absent. As Berkeley frames the entire cosmos in breathtaking theological terms, that all the choir of heaven and furniture of the earth, in a word, all those bodies which compose the mighty frame of the world, have not any subsistence without a mind. Let us reflect on the sheer audacity of this claim. Locke told us we live in a world of representations. Berkeley tells us there is no physical world behind the representations. There is only the act of perceiving. What we call matter is just a bundle of sensory ideas that God consistently impresses upon our minds in a predictable, orderly fashion. The laws of physics, for Berkeley, are simply the grammar of God's language to our senses. Now, here is the paradox of Berkeley's position. Despite being the ultimate idealist, the man who dissolved the material world into pure perception, Berkeley is arguably the purest empiricist of them all. Why? Because he refused to believe in anything he could not directly observe. Locke believed in invisible, unobservable atoms. Berkeley refused to traffic in such unverifiable metaphysical baggage. He stuck strictly to the data of consciousness. He said, "Look into your own mind. What do you find? Colors, sounds, tastes, textures, ideas. That is reality. Why invent a mysterious substance called matter that we can never see, touch, or prove?" Berkeley's idealism is a philosophical masterpiece of parsimony and logical rigor, but in dissolving the physical world, he bequeathed a terrifying existential crisis to his successors. If reality is just a flux of perceptions in individual minds, then what happens to the stability of scientific law? What happens to the objective, external anchor that keeps our perceptions grounded? And most dangerously of all, what happens to the self that does all this perceiving? One man picked up Berkeley's mantle and asked the most devastating question of all. He looked inward to find the self, the permanent I that perceives, and he found absolutely nothing, just a chaotic stream of disconnected impressions. Let's move to our fifth and final philosopher,
The ultimate empiricist who took the entire edifice of philosophy, shook it violently, and asked, if you can't trace your idea back to a sensory impression, burn it. He is the greatest philosopher ever to write in the English language, David Hume.
We have journeyed through the ambitious architecture of Bacon, the mechanical materialism of Hobbes, the systematic clarity of Locke, and the audacious idealism of Berkeley. Each of them, in their own way, tried to build a stable fortress of knowledge upon the shifting scars of sensory experience. But our fifth and final philosopher is not a builder. He is the demolition expert. He is the man who took the entire empiricist project, followed its premises with terrifying, uncompromising logic, and showed that it does not lead to certainty. It leads to a radical, unsettling, and profoundly honest form of philosophical skepticism. Meet David Hume, 1711 to 1776. Widely regarded as the greatest philosopher ever to write in the English language, and undoubtedly the most devastating critic in the history of Western thought. Hume begins his philosophical project with a deceptively simple, yet utterly transformative distinction. He argues that the entire contents of our mind can be divided into two and only two categories: impressions and ideas. Impressions are our vivid, forceful, and immediate sensory experiences: the heat of a flame, the redness of an apple, the sharp pain of a cut. Ideas, on the other hand, are the faint, pale copies of these impressions that we retain in memory and manipulate in imagination. Hume then enacts what is arguably the most important epistemological rule in the history of philosophy. He calls it the copy principle, and it is the ultimate empirical litmus test. He writes in his treatise of human nature, "All the perceptions of the human mind resolve themselves into two distinct kinds, which I shall call impressions and ideas. The difference betwixt these consists in the degrees of force and liveliness." And then he delivers the devastating methodological commandment: we cannot think of anything not previously perceived by our senses. This is Hume's scalpel. If you have an idea in your mind, God, the soul, substance, infinity, you must trace it back to its original impression. If you cannot find the sensory origin, the idea is literally meaningless. It is a product of imagination, not of reason. Now, with this sharpened blade, Hume turns to the most sacred pillars of human knowledge and proceeds to cut them down, one by one. First, he attacks causation, the very concept of cause and effect. Leaves. This is, without exaggeration, one of the most important arguments in the entire philosophical canon. Hume asks, when you see one billiard ball strike another, and the second ball begins to move, what exactly do you perceive? Do you perceive the necessary connection between the two events? Do you see the power or the force that makes the second ball move? No, you see ball A move. You see ball B move. You see the spatial contiguity and the temporal succession, but you do not and cannot perceive the invisible bond of causality itself. As he famously states in his Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding, when we look about us towards external objects and consider the operation of causes, we are never able, in a single instance, to discover any power or necessary connection. We only find that the one does actually, in fact, follow the other. Hume concludes that causation is not a logical, rational necessity. It is simply a psychological habit. We repeatedly observe the constant conjunction of two events, and our minds, through sheer force of custom, form a belief that the future will resemble the past. But this belief has no rational foundation. The sun rose this morning, but logic does not prove it will rise tomorrow. Only experience tells us it will, and experience only tells us about the past, never about the future. Second, and even more unsettlingly, Hume turns his scalpel inward, toward the very concept of the self. Locke believed in a continuous, enduring consciousness. Descartes famously declared, "I think, therefore I am." But Hume asks, look into your own mind. What do you actually find when you introspect? Do you find a stable, permanent I? A unified substance called the soul? No. You find a chaotic torrent of shifting perceptions. One moment you feel hunger, the next a cold breeze, the next a memory of a childhood friend, the next a desire to write. There is no single, unchanging self underlying these states. He writes with ruthless clarity, What we call a mind is nothing but a heap or collection of different perceptions, united together by certain relations, and supposed, though falsely, to be endowed with a perfect simplicity and identity. A heap, a bundle of ever-changing, ephemeral perceptions with no central core, no CEO of consciousness. When you are not perceiving anything, you simply cease to exist, only to reconstitute a moment later when another perception arises. The ego, for Hume, is a fiction, and now, having demolished causation and dissolved the self, Hume delivers his ultimate, most incendiary, most famous verdict on the entire history of metaphysics. At the end of his enquiry, he issues a challenge that still echoes through every philosophy department on Earth. He writes, "If we take in our hand any volume, let us ask, does it contain any abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number? No. Does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact and existence? No. Commit it then to the flames, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion." Commit it then to the flames. This is the final, terrifying destination of pure empiricism. All those grand metaphysical systems, all those discussions about God, the soul, substance, and ultimate reality are for Hume nothing but empty noise, cleverly disguised as profound wisdom. They cannot be traced back to sensory impressions, and therefore they are not knowledge. They are poetry dressed up in philosophical robes. But here's the beauty of Hume. Unlike the dogmatists who came before him, and unlike the nihilists who would come after, Hume was remarkably cheerful about this radical skepticism. He famously said that when he finished his philosophical work and walked outside to play backgammon with his friends, the force of nature and social interaction dispelled his doubts. He did not advocate despair, he advocated intellectual humility. He showed us that human reason has limits, and that we must learn to live with probability, uncertainty, and constant, honest questioning. He did not destroy philosophy, he purified it. He woke Immanuel Kant from his dogmatic slumbers and forced the entire continental tradition to start over from scratch. He is the true father of the scientific worldview, the patron saint of doubt, and the ultimate empiricist. So, let us now take a step back and look at the entire journey we have undertaken. From the pioneer who taught us to observe, to the materialist who reduced thought to motion, to the founder who gave us the blank slate, to the idealist who denied matter itself, and finally to the destroyer who showed us the limits of our own reason. What is the final verdict on empiricism? And more importantly, where does that leave us? Let's wrap it all up in the conclusion. And so, we have arrived at the end of our intellectual odyssey. We began with Francis Bacon, the fierce prophet of observation, who commanded us to abandon the dusty texts of authority and interrogate nature itself. He gave us the inductive method and warned us of the mental idols that distort our vision. We moved to the relentless Thomas Hobbes, who reduced the human soul to clattering gears and mechanical motions, telling us that imagination is merely decaying sense, and that reason is nothing but calculation. We met the systematic John Locke, who framed the human mind as a blank slate upon which experience alone writes its endless characters. He taught us to distinguish between the solid, objective primary qualities and the subjective, mind-dependent secondary qualities. We encountered the audacious rebel George Berkeley, who took Locke's premises with such ruthless logic that he dissolved the material world entirely, declaring that to be is to be perceived. Existence itself is a function of consciousness. And finally, we confronted the ultimate destroyer, David Hume, who sharpened the empiricist blade to its finest edge and eviscerated our most cherished beliefs. He showed us that causation is just a psychological habit, that the self is merely a bundle of fleeting perceptions, and that most of our grand metaphysical speculations deserve to be committed to the flames. Now, let us step back and ask the most crucial question of all. What is the legacy of this empirical revolution? The answer is both magnificent and terrifying. On one hand, empiricism is the philosophical engine that powered the scientific revolution. Without Bacon's insistence on evidence, we would have no modern medicine. Without Hobbes's computational view of reason, we would have no artificial intelligence or cognitive science. Without Locke's critique of innate ideas, we would have no developmental psychology. Empiricism taught humanity to ask, what does the evidence show, rather than, what does tradition say? It is the beating heart of modern intellectual life. But on the other hand, empiricism, carried to its ultimate conclusion in the hands of Hume, reveals a profound, almost vertiginous truth about the human condition. Absolute certainty is forever beyond our reach. We are finite creatures, trapped within the narrow corridors of our own senses. We cannot step outside our own minds to verify the external world. We cannot prove that the sun will rise tomorrow. We cannot rationally justify the very concept of causation that we use every second of our lives. This is the grand paradox of empiricism. It gave us the tools to build the modern world, yet it also revealed the shaky foundations upon which that world is built. So, where does that leave us? Does it leave us as paralyzed skeptics, unable to act, drowning in doubt? No. The true genius of David Hume was not his destruction of certainty. It was his profound honesty about our limitations. Hume famously taught us that while reason cannot defeat philosophical skepticism, nature always does. We must get up, go outside, play backgammon, converse with our friends, and live our lives. We must accept that knowledge is not about indubitable foundations. It is about high probabilities, well-tested hypotheses, and the pragmatic utility of our beliefs. The empiricist does not claim to know with absolute, transcendent certainty. The empiricist claims to know well enough. And that humility, that willingness to revise our beliefs in the face of new evidence, is the greatest gift these 5 philosophers have bequeathed to humanity. Before we close, I want to leave you with a final challenge. In our modern age, we are bombarded with information: social media, news, opinions, algorithms. The idols of the mind that Bacon warned us about are more powerful than ever. The language deceptions that he called the idols of the marketplace dominate our political discourse. And Hume's warning that we cannot derive an ought from an is, that empirical facts alone cannot dictate our moral values, remains one of the most urgent philosophical insights of our time. So, I leave you with this question. In a world saturated with data and opinion, how do you distinguish genuine empirical knowledge from mere cognitive illusion? And more fundamentally, are you willing to live with uncertainty? Or do you secretly crave the absolute, unchanging truths that empiricism took away? That is the ongoing, unfinished project of philosophy. And it is a project that requires all of us to be, in our own way, humble empiricists. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Do you find Hume's skepticism liberating or terrifying? Are you a rationalist at heart, or do you side with the empiricists? I read every comment, and I want to hear your voice. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the history of philosophy, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next intellectual adventure. We have many more thinkers to explore. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the senses. Until next time, keep questioning, keep observing, and never stop thinking.